Hello, welcome to the second part of the introduction that I'm doing to this series of revision lectures on the 1C Edexcel course, which basically covers Stuart Britain. So in the first part of the lecture, I covered the sort of background to this time period and its context, leading up into the sort of various issues that sort of plagued Charles during his reign and instability of that period between 1625 and 1649, culminating in Charles being executed after the First and Second Civil Wars. So this next lecture, we'll be looking into what basically comes next. In other words, the failed search for an adequate settlement in the 11 years after, what's referred to as the interregnum, and then the restoration after, and how that eventually once again ends up in the collapse of Stuart monarchy. So I'll sort of get started straight away. So with the execution of Charles, you don't just have Charles being executed, you also have Parliament almost immediately within the next sort of few months abolishing the monarchy formally and officially declaring and establishing England as a republic, or they refer to it as the Commonwealth, which becomes the name that is given to the new republic. And so much in the same way the initial period we discussed was, in other words, that first 20 years, that instability which plagues English society or English politics does not suddenly disappear with the execution of Charles. He wasn't the only problem standing in their way. And so the next 11 years are spent trying to establish a stable republican state or settlement or solution that is acceptable to the nation as a whole. Unsurprisingly, it also ends in failure. And so those 11 years don't end up coming to much by the end of the period, with Charles II, the son of Charles I, being restored to the throne in 1660. And so England's short-lived republican experiment comes to an end and is essentially seen as a failure by the end of that time period. And so when we look at this period, there are essentially a series of different experiments that are carried out in terms of governments, each of which fail and fail to kind of provide a lasting solution to those problems. And so the first experiment is one which actually reveals from the starting point just how little planning actually went into the regicide in the first place. As I mentioned in the last lecture, at no point was there ever really an intention to actually kill Charles until, well, essentially when that time came towards the end. The regicide is basically carried out in quite a hasty way without real planning having gone into it. And what happens after really reveals that point. So the army really aren't sure what to do next in terms of what sort of government to install, the army being the ones who are now in charge. They initially feel like it might be worth having elections to basically have new MPs brought into Parliament. But the problem is the national mood, the shock that's been spread throughout the country as a result of this quite surprising event. It's never really happened in England's history in that sense. The army basically decides that elections aren't really going to be a sensible decision, and so instead power simply passes to the MPs at Westminster, and kind of they end up basically inheriting that power instead, both the powers they initially held as a parliament, but also the executive and prerogative powers that Charles himself had as king. And so this parliament, which was declared as the rump parliament by Charles, he refers to them as a rump. He refuses to accept their authority when he's being tried by them. They declare themselves the sole legislative authority in the land. They elect a council of state to govern in their name, similar to the privy councils which kings would normally govern with this sort of inner council. So they'd elect a group of 3 or 4 individuals who would sort of do the more important functions and roles. They abolished the monarchy formally, as I've already mentioned. They also abolished the House of Lords in March 1649, and then after they declare themselves a Commonwealth. So the shape of the new government starts to take shape. However, the rump are really in a very unfortunate situation. They basically inherit the worst possible the worst possible situation. So you already consider the issues that are that exist in the country that already existed, having come out of civil war, combined with the various different issues in terms of the shock and the horror and divisions caused by the regicide and the killing of Charles. They also, at the same time, are tasked with reforming the government in the country by the army. They're basically expected to carry out various different reforms to the law and social reforms. And then you also add to that for the first time, you've got Parliament being tasked with governing a country as a whole, something they had never ever been asked to do and had no real experience in doing either. And so suddenly, the poor rump have this mammoth task of governing a country, which they're really not up to scratch in terms of carrying out that task and the range of different requirements that it entails. And so, as I say, the rump is tasked by the army, that is, they are tasked with enacting various reforms to the law and government. The problem is, though, this reform comes very slow. So initially they kind of do pass quite a few laws or various different reforms, but after the first couple of years, their rate of reform slows down significantly, which, as I'll come back to in a moment, doesn't please the army. But then in addition to that, other troubles begin to mount. So the rump continues to need to impose very high taxes on the country because they need to maintain a large standing army, the new model army which came into effect, as we mentioned, during the First Civil War. And they have to maintain this large army because that army is necessary to maintain their own existence and to kind of protect the rump, both against domestic threats and domestic rebellions that could potentially crop up, but also more significantly and increasingly more significant foreign troubles and interventions that are taking place. So Charles's execution almost immediately triggers large-scale rebellions both in Ireland and Scotland. The Irish rebellion, of course, becomes quite famous as that's where he brutally suppresses the Irish and carries out quite controversial massacres in places like Drogheda of quite a lot of women and children. But then that was, to be honest, quite an easy rebellion to put down for Cromwell. The more significant threat was the threat of the Scottish rebellion. The Scottish immediately also rebel and decide to back Charles II by declaring him as the rightful king. And this is the same Scottish force, essentially, which initially backs Parliament during the First Civil War. So they're quite organised and powerful military force. And then that army, though, is eventually defeated by Cromwell, which really kind of cements his authority within the army. But that was a much more difficult task, and in many ways, actually, the crucial battle he wins to defeat the Scottish is seen to be quite a miraculous victory that sort of speaks to the genius of Cromwell as a military strategist. And so you have the rump kind of relying upon the army to keep them in place, and Cromwell in particular rises to this position of power and prominence as he kind of helps to put down these rebellions. And so what you start to find is within the first few years of the rump's, after the first few years of the rump's existence, or the rump's rule, Cromwell and the army start to tire and lose patience with the very slow rate of reform I've already discussed that the rump was basically carrying out, or rather had not been carrying out. And so, as I say, Cromwell and the army had been making various different demands about reform of things like the law, in terms of how the law actually functioned, reforming various aspects of sort of social codes, etc., reforming how the electorate functioned in the franchise. And that latter one in particular is really what then triggers Cromwell to take this next step. So Cromwell, having lost patience with the rump, decides to basically abolish and dissolve the rump parliament. What really kind of forces his hand. So their kind of relationship had been sort of disintegrating slowly over the last sort of year and a half, 2 years. And Cromwell kind of begins to increasingly feel like the rump is quite self-serving and actually intended to try and maintain power for themselves and keep it indefinitely. And what really convinces them of this point is when the MPs decide to hold new elections, which on principle Cromwell's fine with, but he wants them to be held under a reformed franchise with a different electorate. The problem is that the MPs try to hold this election under the old franchise, which triggers quite significant fears among Cromwell and the army, because under the old franchise, the current mood in the country would have produced a majority of conservative MPs or conservative views in Parliament. And actually, it's worth pointing at this stage, because I've not mentioned already, when I say conservative, we obviously don't mean conservative in the modern political sense. We mean conservative more of a sort of descriptor. In terms of their views, they're more conservative in terms of their wishes and desires for change in the country. So the rump, as we mentioned beforehand again, after the Second Civil War, had increasingly begun to be dominated by these sort of more conservative elements who kind of wanted stability. They weren't too keen on reforming too greatly, whereas the army, in opposition to that, wanted quite significant reforms eventually. So when we say conservative, the best way to think about it is they generally want to maintain status quo and don't want to rock the boat too much or create too much change. And so Cromwell's hand is forced by these MPs, who essentially he feels that new elections from the old franchise might increase conservative representation within Parliament, and that could also potentially freeze out the army, who again, as I said, are increasingly in a hostile relation with the rump and sort of this conservative element across the country. And And so they kind of fear that their sort of hopes for legal and social reforms might be dashed permanently. And so they basically dissolve the Rump Parliament. And initially, to be honest, Oliver Cromwell does it without any real intention or knowledge of what he plans to do next. So again, it's very kind of unplanned in terms of the moves that are being made here and sort of spontaneously reacting to events as they unfold. And so before I kind of go into what Cromwell does next, at this point it's kind of worth exploring, because again, we've mentioned him briefly up until this point, but Cromwell as sort of one of the two dominant personalities of this time period, like Charles. We discussed Charles's personality, but at this point in time, it's also worth kind of going into who this man Cromwell is, what his background is, what his personality is like, because it really reveals quite a lot of interesting insights into this time period. And so it's worth mentioning at this point because it's by the early 1650s that Cromwell has completed his quite rapid and in many ways quite unlikely rise to the top of English society, sort of English political society. And it's sort of he'd come by sort of about 1653 to become the dominant political figure within England. And so as an individual, again, it's quite unlikely because Cromwell himself is from a lesser gentry background. He is a country gentleman, but he's not sort of, he's from a smaller gentry background, not as sort of prominent or prosperous as sort of others are. There's quite a wide variety of members of the gentry. He initially kind of serves as an MP for Huntingdon, his local constituency, in 1628, which, if you recall, sort of the parliaments that were causing Charles quite a lot of trouble at the beginning of his reign. And so Cromwell is believed to have fallen upon hard times shortly after this. He'd basically gotten into conflict with the local borough corporation, which is essentially the local borough government in the local sort of government in his area. Essentially, he'd been accused of corruption and trying to expose it. They were sort of none too pleased, and that sort of seemed to have led to him losing some of his status and actually having fallen upon quite hard times, and essentially having worked as a middle yeoman, which is basically a step beneath that, and actually quite a humiliating and difficult experience for Cromwell, given his original background. And it's during this point in his life where he seemed to have experienced a quite strong Puritan conversion, and sort of adopted some of his later religious views and his kind of later strict and devout Puritan religious convictions. And so shortly after that, he then is able to recover some of his former prosperity and kind of do well for himself once again. And so he becomes involved in the Civil War as a Puritan who kind of is very much in line with the views of men like John Pym. He sort of takes to that cause quite strongly and gets involved and decides to join the parliamentary side and become a cavalry officer. And so initially he has quite huge military. He has quite huge military success, mainly because he's able to instill quite a lot of discipline within his forces. He also has quite other positive attributes as a military commander. The fact that he's able to judge based on merit as opposed to judging people based on their class or their class background. And so he's able to sort of rise through the ranks and become quite a significant member of the army, or the armed forces, or the new model army eventually. That's the first side of Cromwell. Then the second thing which needs quite a lot of consideration are Cromwell's religious views and convictions, because they undoubtedly play a significant role in shaping his views and attitudes. And in particular, he's got a strong belief in the idea of divine providence. In other words, a belief in kind of God's plan, and that God has essentially already preordained what will happen. And so as a result, what he's often doing as an individual in terms of his decision making is he's often waiting for divine providence to guide him when it comes to making important decisions. In other words, he often looks for signs of what God's will was or what God's will is before making a decision. So before, for example, he takes the decision to put Charles on trial and attempt to execute him, he really waits quite a while for signs of what God's will was and what divine providence was to basically make that decision. So that's the first thing. He has this kind of these religious convictions. The second important area are, however, despite him being a religious radical, or despite his reputation as a religious radical, is he actually is in many ways quite a conservative individual. Again, in the same way we discussed earlier. as like somebody from his background, he tends to be in favour of sort of maintaining stability. He isn't really so keen on completely abolishing monarchy, and actually arguably kind of shifts his views around quite a lot in this area. He sort of believes in godly reformation, sort of whatever that kind of means from his perspective, or sort of a godly reformation of sort of manners and sort of improving people's moral character as a Puritan. That's the sort of beliefs he has. Then also linked to that, he broadly believes in religious toleration. And oftentimes when we say religious toleration, that also includes of some genuinely radical religious groups and sects. And so on the one hand, he has religious views of a genuine radical Puritan. But on issues like challenging authority, things like that, maintenance of the monarchy, he himself isn't so radical or so extreme in his views. And he still, as I say, remains a conservative member of the gentry. And so in many ways, Cromwell, who defines this period, is a man of many great contradictions that's quite hard to explain as an individual. And so why that's worth mentioning is because when you then see the solutions he begins to adopt as an individual, you'll see he often adopts quite contradictory solutions, or he often kind of switches between modes of government that are quite different in their nature. But that really speaks to the contradictions of Cromwell as a man, who himself is never really quite sure on exactly what he wants to do with the country. And he's never wedded to any particular form of government at all. And so after he dissolves the Rump Parliament, it seems like the religious radical side of his personality is the dominant half and wins the day to begin with. And so when he basically takes advice from his advisors of what to do next, he basically takes the suggestion of one of his more radical, batty advisors, a man called Colonel Harrison, who basically is a fifth monarchist, who are kind of a strange, radical religious sect who believe that Jesus' return is imminent and that they should basically be preparing the world for his return, his fifth monarchy, basically. And so he takes the suggestion of this man, Colonel Harrison, to basically create an assembly of godly men to enact Cromwell's godly reformation. And essentially, from this guy Harrison's perspective, to prepare the world for King Jesus. Cromwell's not so enamored with the idea of, well, in the same sort of batty way in which Harrison wanted it, but he basically takes the idea forward. And so he creates a new assembly, or a new parliament, called the Nominated Assembly, often referred to as the Bare Bones Parliament. It's basically nicknamed after a London preacher who was one of the first was one of the members of that parliament, a man called Praise God Nicholas Barban, who you can tell from his name was quite a radical London preacher. And so what this parliament is basically set, it's not, as opposed to being elected by the nation as a whole, it is essentially chosen, hence why it's called the Nominated Assembly. The number of the list of MPs who join it are basically put together or nominated in 1653 by, first of all, the generals, and also with the churches, the independent churches in particular, being asked to nominate members. And so the list is eventually narrowed down to 140 people. Now, at this point, it's worth saying that despite this sort of seemingly radical nature to the Nominated Assembly and Bare Bones Parliament, the majority of the members are actually still quite conservative by nature themselves. And actually, despite guys like Barban being involved in it, he tends to be part of a very small radical minority. So the majority of this assembly, again, ends up being quite conservative in their nature. And so that ends up kind of being part of his downfall later on. So initially they're able to function quite properly and sort of pass a series of minor reforms and legal measures, things like sort of helping debtors, regulations for treating lunatics, etc. However, what really kind of puts an end to the Bare Bones Parliament is when the more radical members of the Assembly try to push through a measure to abolish church tithes. In other words, a sort of tax that is paid to churches. You'll often see that conservatives, or people with kind of more conservative leanings, always want to defend the church, because the established church is seen to be a guarantor and a protector of sort of social stability and order. And so the abolition of church tithes is seen to be an attack on property rights, because the idea is the church actually owns land and therefore charges rents. So, that's sort of my own kind of basic understanding of the principle, they basically charged sort of rents, etc., to the individuals who lived there. And so the abolition of church tithes was seen as an attack on property rights, which naturally spooks the gentry, who of course their entire sort of power and wealth is based primarily upon the land. And so the Conservatives in the Assembly are massively spooked by this plan to abolish church tithes, and that what they therefore do is they kind of conspire to meet together earlier than a usual assembly in December, without radical members being there or being present, and they therefore vote to dissolve the Assembly and give its authority back to Cromwell to prevent this measure from passing. And so the measure therefore fails, as does the nominated Assembly, and it by basically in an attempt to keep Conservatives satisfied. And so once again, you have Cromwell now unsure what to do next. He has a situation where he once again needs to create a new sort of parliament or a new government. And so at this point, given the failure of the old one and sort of again this need to keep Conservatives happy, the other side of Cromwell's personality, this sort of more conservative side, again seems to become more predominant. And so the pendulum swings rather towards Cromwell adopting a more moderate approach. And so he ends up adopting a form of government known as the Protectorate, or known as the Protectorate, which essentially resembles the old system of monarchy, but in a more limited fashion. And so you end up now having a single chamber parliament elected, of course, by the country. And the idea is to have elections every 3 years at least, and they would sit for at least 5 months. But then crucially, Cromwell would sit as the Lord Protector, and in many ways his role would mirror what the king's role was under the old system, under the monarchical system. And so it's a system that is designed to deliberately bear similarities with the government under the monarchical system, and sort of carry out a process of healing the nation and kind of regain sort of lost conservative support / cooperation. However, once again, unsurprisingly, it is a short-lived solution. In this case, it's because Republican MPs who were still resentful of having had the rump resolved by Cromwell still kind of maintain this hostility towards him, and they basically refused to approve what is referred to as the instrument of government. That basically is Cromwell's new constitution that he adopts along with the Protectorate Parliament. And so Cromwell, once again, in response to this, is forced to dissolve Parliament again. And so we now have 3 forms of government, each of which have now failed and been dissolved. What does Cromwell do next? It's at this point then that we get what is often seen to be one of the most famous periods of government in this time frame, which is the rule of the Major Generals in 1655, which, as you can guess by the title, is essentially military rule. Cromwell divides the country up into 11 districts, each of which he places under the control of a Major General, supported by the creation of a local army or militia, which is, of course, as you can imagine, going to be paid for by local gentry paying taxes to support them. And so the reason why he basically adopts this form of government is because there was a royalist uprising in 1655. Cromwell defeats it quite easily, but it basically makes Cromwell believe or convinces Cromwell that he needs to assert greater control over the country. And therefore the Major Generals, the Major Generals are charged with maintaining security and order across the country. Now, again, this is a quite famous period because the Major Generals creates or leads to quite a lot of huge resentment amongst the gentry in particular, for a couple of reasons. The first, of course, is their really heavy-handed nature. Again, this is the very famous part. They're known for having clamped down on various different social activities. Cromwell basically had charged them, alongside maintaining order and security, with enacting his godly reformation, which, is a great phrase. And so it involved things like clamping down on horse racing, other kind of like theatres, etc., kind of various different social activities, harmless social activities. Which is the first side. And the second thing is the local gentry who previously governed their own affairs with their sort of local borough corporations, they really resent having outsiders imposed upon them by Cromwell. And so again, they're really unhappy with the situation, and this general period is one of unhappiness. And so Cromwell, again, as ever the person who's indecisive, recognizes, well, you could argue instead it was actually just somebody who was quite sensible and pragmatic. He recognizes the need for compromise and basically decides to end the rule of Major Generals and creates once again a new constitution and calls for a new parliament. And so then we have our final form of government under Cromwell's rule, or during Cromwell's period, which is the Second Protectorate Parliament, but oftentimes referred to as the Humble Petition as well, due to the Constitution, which is basically enacted. So a new Parliament is created that in turn also put together a new constitution or document called the Humble Petition. And the Humble Petition is basically an offer by the gentry of the country to try and create stability once and for all, but they would do so by making Cromwell king. And so they offer Cromwell the role of king, and they reintroduce the House of Lords and reinstate hereditary succession. And so it would end up looking much like, again, the old monarchy, well, largely resemble the old system monarchy, but again, with some slightly more defined powers that were sort of granted to Cromwell as the sort of the king. And it is sort of an attempt to define his role, which up until this point has been quite vague and unclear, which he just seemingly has limited power as someone who controls the army. And in that sense, it's meant to kind of place a limit on those powers he controls and exercises. And so Cromwell is formally offered the crown, but famously, as you all know, he rejects the crown. He chooses to reject it and instead adopt the title of Lord Protector, which essentially ends up looking like the king, but in all but name. Cromwell rejects the crown, fearing that he might potentially alienate the army, who again tend to harbour quite radical thoughts and are seen to be quite keen on the Republican experiment. So he rejects it for that purpose. He's then a year later offered it a second time. And at this point, it's really possible, people often speculate he might have accepted and was actually really considering the idea because it was just seen to be the best way to solve the issues of instability. But he dies before he can accept it. So it's one of the great what-ifs. If Cromwell survives long enough, does he basically accept the crown? And what happens next? We probably never get a restored Stuart monarchy as a result. Or maybe we have rebellion by the army, who knows? And so Cromwell dies without having accepted the monarchy. And so his son Richard is basically placed as his successor and becomes the new Lord Protector. However, at this point, Republican rule collapses very quickly and disintegrates into anarchy shortly after this point. So Richard succeeds his father after being nominated by him as the successor in September 1658. However, the army forced him to resign less than a year later in May 1659. Essentially, Richard had become too close to the army too close to the gentry as opposed to the army, which sort of led to that mistrust amongst the army, spreading amongst the army. And so the army basically decide to get rid of Richard Cromwell and, strangely enough, bring back the rump, the same rump who had executed Charles and been scrapped by Cromwell, who a lot of members had basically still been alive to carry out their roles. But their relations eventually revert back to type, in other words, hostility. The rump basically don't know from their lessons and basically set about very quickly antagonizing the army once more. And so open conflict very soon breaks out between those two sides. And so Republican rule, as I say, collapses very quickly afterwards. So a man called George Monk, or a general called George Monk, who's an old royalist sympathiser, but Cromwell had basically left him in charge of the army in Scotland. So he's one of these quite pragmatic men who were on the royalist side, but sort of when the king was executed, decided they had to basically serve and join the main army. And as I say, Cromwell basically places him in charge of Scotland. And so with kind of anarchy breaking out in the south, with this conflict breaking out between the army and Parliament, General Monk basically marches south to restore order. And in response to public opinion, which is basically due to all this chaos, increasingly desperate for a return to stability, he basically goes to see Charles II, who is living in exile in France, and he negotiates alongside him a deal to have the monarchy restored, and this is agreed by Parliament. And so in February 1660, General Monk enters London to restore order after that chaos has basically been caused by the army, who are essentially attempting to remove the Rump Parliament. And Monk basically, in response, he allows the old members of the Long Parliament to return. So these are the ones who had actually been purged under Pride's purge in 1648. And he invites them so that Parliament can basically formally vote to dissolve itself. Again, if you recall, in 1642, the Triennial Act, alongside it, an act was passed, an act of dissolution, that meant only Parliament could dissolve itself. And so the stage is therefore set for the return and restoration of Charles II in 1660. So in April 1660, a new parliament is voted and elected and meets, and they agree to a document or a pact known as the Declaration of Breda, which was basically an offer presented to them by Charles II, and it is essentially an offer made by Charles to the ruling elite of the country, promising cooperation. Because from their perspective, the problem is, after everything they've done and what's happened, they're naturally quite worried about what their relationship with Charles might look like. And so Charles essentially promises to cooperate with Parliament, first of all, and he secondly, this is really important, he grants amnesty for all actions that have been carried out during the interregnum. And I think the final point as well is he also promises to pay the army their arrears of pay, which again manages to solve the army issue fairly well. In addition to that, so Charles is restored to the throne, and no preconditions are made to agree to that. And so what happens is essentially is that they agree. The commitment is made. They agree that actually they'll make commitments or details about what the restoration will look like at a later point. And in the meantime, Charles will basically be restored. But quite ominously, Charles is declared to be king in the 12th year of his reign. In other words, he views himself as having been made king not by the authority of Parliament, who basically voted to allow him to return, but he himself instead views himself to be king by God's will. And so much like his father, believes in himself as a divine right king. And so at this point in time, it doesn't really make much of a stir, but it really does kind of offer a bit of insight into what he really thought, and you see later on the impact that has as a personality of Charles. And so this first 4 years after Charles' restoration, you see what was referred to as the Restoration Settlement being put together. So a series of laws being put together which basically decide and govern what the Restoration monarchy will essentially look like in terms of its relationship with Parliament. Those things I've said already that were agreed to be discussed later on. And so the settlement was, as I say, to be worked on by Parliament after the King's return. And so initially, the first Parliament that is in charge is a Parliament known as the Convention Parliament. And that Parliament is actually quite a conciliatory Parliament in terms of the tone it adopts and the nature of the policies it tries to pursue. It's referred to as the Convention Parliament because rather than being called by Charles, it was called by Parliament itself. And so it was designed as a result to only be a temporary parliament because parliaments are in theory to be called by the monarchy. And so they dissolved themselves in December of 1660 and called new elections. But crucially and fatefully, in that year there is a failed rebellion by a fifth monarchist group, this same kind of radical group you mentioned earlier who kind of believed in the return of King Jesus. And so this once again reignites fears across the country of radical groups. And what that does is in response is it leads to a huge royalist majority being produced in that year's elections. And so you get the parliament being referred to as the Cavalier Parliament in response due to its sympathies to the monarchy. And crucially, and this is a really important point, unlike the Convention Parliament, which as I said was quite a conciliatory, quite sensible parliament in many ways, the Cavalier Parliament, due to its nature, actually has rather different intentions and has a more vengeful tone and has more vengeful ambitions and intentions. And their intention is to create, as a result, a more vengeful settlement. And so they end up muddying and messing around with a lot of the agreed restrictions and convention and laws that have been passed by the Convention Parliament. So the Convention Parliament had basically reinforced some of the restrictions on the King's Parliament, and the Cavaliers go about basically weakening those restrictions, as well as renewing the religious conflicts from Charles I's reign. So they basically messed things up on two counts. So with regards to political changes, the Convention Parliament retained the 1641 Triennial Act, as well as maintaining parliamentary control of the militia and kept prerogative courts abolished. The Cavaliers, however, go about undermining this clarity and these laws that have been passed and leave some grey areas. So, for example, the Militia Act, it places the king, they pass a Militia Act which places the king in supreme command of the army as opposed to Parliament. And crucially, they revise the Triennial Act, so it's still in force, but crucially, it no longer has a mechanism in place to force a recall if the king fails to do so, which again we'll come back to later on when you see how the impact this has when Charles basically violates the act. And then the follow-up issue, which is a more significant problem, which we'll come back to when we look at sub-theme 2A, are the religious changes. And so the Cavalier Parliament sees a renewal of attempts by strict high church Anglicans to reimpose the Laudian system, this Arminian church system in the church, and basically pass a series of laws that enforce quite strict uniformity of belief in an attempt to destroy Puritanism and any sort of lingering nonconformity, which had obviously been spreading quite a lot during the interregnum. This kind of combination of acts is often referred to as the Clarendon Code. So that basically refers to a series of 4 or 5 acts passed by the Cavalier Parliament that essentially try to enforce uniformity and strict uniformity. And so you have the Restoration Settlement, in other words, not really resolving much and leaving quite a few grey areas. And so very shortly afterwards, you get the renewal of conflict between the king and his parliaments. And so suspicion and conflict begins to emerge quite quickly during Charles's reign over fears by the public or by the political nation that he is pursuing a secretly pro-Catholic agenda. These fears, though, also become heightened by his use or concerns over his use of his prerogative powers, and also mounting or continuing issues, again, much like his father, of foreign policy problems. So the first major crisis comes, and I believe it's 1665, following the disastrous Second Anglo-Dutch War, which is waged alongside Catholic France, who were themselves trying to destroy the Protestant Dutch Republic. Which in and of itself caused some suspicion, but more importantly, the war itself ends in disaster. The Dutch famously break through a blockade that had been surrounding them on the Medway River, and they destroy the English ships anchored on the other side, which basically turns the tide of the war in their favour, and it helps lead to a settlement which works in the Dutch's favour as a result. So then problems begin to mount as a result. But the problems really come to a head when the fear of Catholicism, or the supposed fear of Charles's Catholicism, heightens significantly following a series of key events. The first is the Great Fire of London, which sparks rumours among people, obviously quite silly rumours, that the fire was basically the work of the king's Catholic advisors, who were basically plotting to seize power. But then things are made significantly worse when Charles II's brother James, who is actually technically his heir to the throne, announces publicly his conversion to Catholicism. So the heir to the throne is now officially a Catholic and has made it public. So major alarm bells are ringing now for the public in general. And the final concern is Charles signs the Treaty of Dover with the French in 1670, which commits him to further wars with the Dutch. And these sort of, in the eyes of the public, confirm his supposed Catholic leanings and sympathies. And so alarm bells are ringing. And so, given these existing fears over Charles's Catholicism, the decisions he takes next, again much like his father, really reveal a lack of foresight and understanding when he basically attempts to establish religious toleration, having seen in response to the Cavalier Parliament obviously establishing quite strict uniformity. So Charles issues a law known as the Declaration of Indulgence in 1672. And this basically suspends the Act of Uniformity, which was one of the crucial acts that ejected members of nonconformist sects from the church in 1662. And so this in and of itself causes concern, as it includes Catholics amongst those who will receive religious toleration. But more importantly, and this is where it really creates a concern, is it rests upon the claim that the monarch has the right, or the monarch's prerogative powers include the right to dispense with the law. So he uses his prerogative powers to basically suspend an act passed by Parliament. And so this creates quite significant concern, even by nonconformists themselves. Sort of more Puritan types who fear these sort of ideas of royal absolutism by Charles II. And so you get Charles basically relying upon his prerogative powers. But then the problem for Charles is he's forced to recall Parliament in 1673 due to his financial problems mounting over his foreign policy failures to basically try and fund his conflicts. And so having been forced to call Parliament to basically receive funds, and this is where he's quite different to his father, Parliament basically refused to give him anything unless he withdraws the declaration, and he basically has to accept it and decides to go with the law, or decides to withdraw the declaration. And so, in addition, so basically Charles basically decides to compromise, unlike his father. And And so in addition, Charles is also unable to sort of to prevent the passing of what is referred to as the Test Act that Parliament passes, which essentially forces any public office holders to deny key Catholic doctrines, otherwise they cannot maintain their position. This famously affects his brother, James II, who, as we've already mentioned, declares his Catholicism, and he's previously Lord Admiral, and so as a result is forced to resign from that position because, of course, he will not deny key Catholic doctrines. And so what's clear is, unlike his father, Charles II really understands when he has overstepped his powers, and as a result is willing to basically compromise in terms of his domestic policy with regards to religion, but also alter his foreign policy as well. And so his choice of advisors also is altered and changes as well. And so he appoints a man called the Earl of Danby, whose title is Earl of Danby, as his treasurer, and he really becomes a significant advisor and member, sort of figure within Parliament, and becomes quite influential. And he's basically quite a strict Anglican who in turn pursues a pro-Dutch foreign policy. And so Charles decides to align himself instead back home with these sort of strict high church Anglicans as a result. And so this Danby's policies can essentially be summed up in two ways. With regards to his religious policies at home, he kind of continues with this strict persecution of nonconformists, both Catholics and Puritans, while at the same time pursuing a pro-Dutch foreign policy. And so he famously seals a marriage between William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch Republic, and also James's daughter Mary, who's a Protestant. That's the Catholic James, of course. So before I move forward, it's worth mentioning at this point that this is where we begin to see the beginning of the emergence, which can be quite confusing oftentimes, of these two distinct parties within Parliament known as Whigs and Tories. So Parliament traditionally does often have divisions of groups, but those groups tend to often not be so distinct and they're often not really permanent. And so for the first time we get Parliament dividing into two permanent, distinct factions or parties that emerge. And they emerge essentially, or begin to emerge, with the rise of Danby as this kind of dominant figure in Parliament. So as I mentioned, Danby seeks to combine a pro-Dutch foreign policy abroad with renewed persecution of Catholics and dissenters at home. And the latter policy in particular causes quite a lot of consternation amongst members of Parliament, along with his ability to dispense royal patronage, in other words, bribe people with positions that Charles grants him the ability to do. And he uses this as a method of parliamentary control to basically gain support for himself. And so this kind of strengthening of Danby's position leads to the rise of an opposition emerging and growing around a man called the Earl of Shaftesbury, who supports in response religious toleration. And so you get these two factions beginning to emerge in response. And so these two factions under Shaftesbury and Danby, they're beginning to emerge right now. They would lead to the emergence of the Whigs and Tories, what would come next, known as the exclusion crisis. So if you ever Google Whigs and Tories and the emergence, that you'll often sort of read that they emerge during the exclusion crisis, but they actually begin to emerge before that with the rise of this man Danby as a dominant figure in Parliament. So these two figures are really crucial in the development of those two factions. And so I'll come back to those who the Whigs and Tories are when I discuss the exclusion crisis. So the next major incident, or which really sort of triggers or sets the stage for the next 10 years, is a rather bizarre incident that essentially triggers this incident of mass hysteria across the country as a result. So despite Charles's change of policy, the religious fears that surround him and sort of various religious fears around Catholicism are triggered or resurface once again and reach their greatest extent with the emergence of the so-called Popish plot in 1678. So most of you, I imagine, will remember quite a few details about this because as an incident it's quite amusing and rather quite bizarre and strange. So this is a period, as I say, of genuine national mass hysteria triggered by essentially a fabricated story of an ex-Jesuit Anglican priest. So Jesuits are basically this missionary Catholic order. A man called Titus Oates, so he's an ex-Jesuit, supposedly, who's now an Anglican priest. And he's basically a serial liar. The guy's full of crap. And has all sorts of random, sort of strange personality traits. And so he claims that he's learnt of a plot by his old order, the Jesuits, to basically murder Charles and replace him with his Catholic brother James. And so Oates himself is not credible. He's basically a bit of a joker. Initially it isn't really believed, but the plot itself gains credibility and becomes more believable after the magistrate that he initially informs of this plot is mysteriously found dead in a London park. And so suddenly this man's crazy plot seems a lot more plausible and possible. And so in response to that, you get this mass hysteria breaking out and the public believing in this plot as a whole. And so for the next year, the broadsheets, the newspaper, the broadsheets begin to detail the plot in sort of various publications and stories of what it actually really involved. And both the public and Parliament accept as a fact, basically, the truth of this story. And this basically for about a year gives Oates the ability and the right to go around accusing anybody he wishes to be as part of the plot, and oftentimes ends up executing them, basically putting them on trial. And so eventually he kind of goes too far and starts accusing every man and his wife, basically, and doubts begin to emerge over his stories once again. Crucially, however, even though the sort of hysteria had died down, it had sort of gone on for enough time to basically spark a full-scale crisis when Shaftesbury's opposition, this group who said turned into the Whigs, attempt to basically exclude James from the succession, starting what is referred to as the exclusion crisis. The plot basically gives or provides the perfect opportunity for the opposition to basically challenge Danby's power in Parliament and exert greater influence as a result. And so at this point, I'll just quickly go through who the Whigs and Tories are very briefly because it relates to the exclusion crisis. So the exclusion crisis witnesses or sees the emergence, or as I say, these two distinct political groupings. So on the one hand, we have the Whigs, who I mentioned beforehand, develop around this guy Shaftesbury, who to begin with, their opposition is towards Danby and his use of royal patronage. But really, what their positions begin to end up being is the Whigs are those who supported exclusion, excluding James from the succession. And they claim as well, in response to that, that toleration of Catholics could cause a drift towards royal absolutism. And so they have this fear of royal absolutism coming from France and Catholic France. And so they also have a very strong fear of Catholicism and believe in clamping down on it because they believe it would also result in a trend towards royal absolutism along the French lines. And they also kind of in response champion the rights of Parliament. Tories, in contrast, are MPs who believe strongly in the powers of the monarchy. This is the crucial thing. They strongly believe in the power of the monarchy, hereditary succession, and respect for authority. And so and this is where it can get confusing, Tories, like Danby, were strict Anglicans who also opposed Catholicism. But despite the fears of Catholicism, for them, respect for royal authority superseded and was more important than the fear of Catholicism, unlike the Whigs. And so that's where it can get a little bit confusing. Why are these guys who are strict Anglicans also supporting Charles despite there being these fears of James's Catholicism? For them, that's a secondary issue. What matters first and foremost is the power of the monarchy and kind of maintaining that system. And so they attack the Whigs as being closet Republicans whose beliefs would essentially destabilise the country again and lead the country to drift once again to civil war. And so the exclusion crisis basically plays out in several stages. So Shaftesbury and his allies, who become the Whigs, begin by making an attempt to impeach Danby. And so Charles attempts to basically save him by dissolving Parliament. And this attempt basically backfires when, in dissolving Parliament, the new elections, due to the nature of the country's mood with the Popish plot, basically produces a much larger anti-Danby majority, and these people, as I say, are now referred to as Whigs. And so Charles is basically unable to prevent that from happening. And then the next step is then the Parliament then begins to introduce a bill to exclude James from the succession, and in his place they would put his illegitimate Protestant son, the Duke of Monmouth. And so, from their perspective, the aim was really to exclude him regardless of the truth of the Popish plot. They probably realised the plot was a load of nonsense at some stage. But from their perspective, the Popish plot was simply a chance to exclude him from the succession, because whether or not he was plotting to kill Charles was irrelevant. Given his Catholicism, it was inevitable that upon becoming king, he would aim to pursue pro-Catholic policies and he would basically eventually adopt them. It was just natural given his personal beliefs and views. And so that's the situation. Charles, however, and this is where you really begin to see the strengths of Charles as a king, is very determined to defeat the bill and has no intention of giving up to it. At this point, of course, you might be wondering, why is Charles so keen to protect James if he believes, if the plot is to kill him? Firstly, I don't think he really cares. He's more interested in defending divine right monarchy. He is uncompromising in his defense of hereditary divine right monarchy, unlike his apathy in other areas and matters. For example, his sort of compromising on the whole French alliance in the early 1670s. The second thing is, Charles has seen some of the details that Oates has mentioned, and he knows based on his own experiences that he's definitely lying. And so he also realizes it's not true. So Charles defeats the first exclusion bill by dissolving Parliament before it can reach the House of Lords, the bill that is. And so a new Parliament then gathers in 1680, and that new Parliament renews the attack on Charles on James by introducing another bill. But this time, when it goes to the Lords, Charles plays a crucial role in defeating it by pressuring the Lords into voting it down. And he does this in particular by personally attending each of the debates to apply his own personal pressure against the bill to help defeat it. And so you start to get a delay in the kind of the passing of the exclusion bills overall. And so this delay begins to work in Charles's favour, because as I already mentioned, the Popish plot's hysteria begins to die down as it becomes increasingly obvious that it's a nonsense plot. And so by 1681, this is the next crucial development as well, Charles had become financially independent of Parliament because he had made a secret pact in the 1670s with his cousin Louis XIV in France to basically, where they would essentially grant him subsidies if he dissolved parliaments at any point when they basically became hostile to France. And so this pact comes into effect after 1681, which allows Charles to basically dissolve parliaments with impunity and not have to worry about taxation money or taxation being granted. And so in 1681, Parliament passed another bill when he calls them, but he dissolves them again without any concern before they pretty quickly. And he, as a follow-up, feeling quite strong in his position, orders Shaftesbury, the leader of the Whig faction, arrested for treason in response. And so the Whigs are basically slowly kind of defeated and crumble kind of as a force in Parliament. And so whilst Shaftesbury initially is kind of acquitted, the final defeat of the Whigs comes soon afterwards when a rather unfortunate plot has several of their members involved in it and basically leads to their destruction. So the Rye House Plot takes place a year later in November 1682, when a series of old Cromwellian, quite desperate old Cromwellian soldiers, concerned by the current situation, as a last-ditch attempt, put together a plot to murder Charles himself and replace him with the Duke of Monmouth. That's James's illegitimate son. And so the plot basically fails. And when the plot basically fails, what it does is it gives Charles the pretext, even though it only involves some Whig leaders, it gives him the appropriate pretext to basically arrest the remaining Whig leaders for treason, basically, and he executes many of the others as well. And so the Whigs' or power and dominance in Parliament really is destroyed in this kind of 2-year period as a result. And so the plot also sparks a royalist backlash that allows, and again, gives Charles the pretext to go about avoiding recalling another parliament for the rest of his reign, because he dies in 1685. And so this is where the Triennial Act of the Cavaliers comes into play, because as I mentioned already, they removed the mechanism that forced a recall. And so Charles basically doesn't call any more parliaments, and he gets away with it. And so he goes about embarking on reforms, in particular to the franchise and kind of borough corporations that were designed to create more compliant future parliaments. He dies, however, in 1685 before he can complete that process, but his brother James succeeds him without any opposition. And so James inherits, unlike Charles, of course, quite a strong position from his brother, who had basically quite skillfully and admirably navigated the quite significant challenges of his later reign. However, James, within 3 years, all but destroys this position and basically leads to the second collapse of the Stuart monarchy, but this time in a rather different fashion. And so by 1688, James's actions had alienated so many people and a wide enough range of people that it resulted in him basically being being the second Stuart forced from the throne. And it all basically relates to James, as you can guess, as a Catholic, attempting to establish religious freedom and legal equality for Catholics. The problem is, though, James uses his royal prerogative to quite forcibly and heavy-handedly enforce his beliefs and views when Parliament was basically quite uncooperative as a result. And so there's quite a few examples of kind of way in which he uses the royal prerogative to do this. So, for example, he personally intervenes in court cases on behalf of Catholics against various different exclusionary laws. So we've got an example of this guy called Edward Hales, who basically is taken to court to try and be forced from his position under the Test Act as a Catholic. He should have, in theory, been that should have gone through. But James, though, personally intervenes to prevent this law from prevent him from facing the consequences of the Test Act. He also, crucially, in 1687 grants a new declaration of indulgence, like his brother did, granting freedom of worship to Catholic and Protestant dissenters. And then, even worse, the following year, in 1688, he orders the declaration to be read from every pulpit in every parish across the country. And in response, any bishop who refuses is basically arrested. So again, he imposes his views in a very heavy-handed way. And so fears across the country reach breaking point, or rather in response, the trigger then is when he basically gives birth to a healthy boy. At this point in time, people aren't concerned because he basically only has one daughter, Mary, and she's a Protestant. And he's basically become quite old. And so people are convinced there is no real chance of a Catholic succession. But shock horror, his young wife, Mary of Modena, or Mary, I think Mary of Modena is pronounced, gives birth to a healthy young boy. And suddenly there is a genuine fear of a Catholic succession to the throne. And that is basically being threatened for the first time. And so at this point, the fears of James's reign really reaches breaking point and triggers the final collapse of Stuart power. The leaders across the political nation, both across every political faction, both Whig, Tory and others in between, sign a letter inviting William of Orange, who of course married Mary, James's daughter, to invade England and take the crown for himself. And basically at that point onwards, that was essentially all she wrote. William lands in Devon in November 1688, and James basically hesitates about potentially resisting him, which gives time essentially for his supporters to basically desert him. And so facing a pretty impossible situation, James essentially has to flee the country and is forced to abdicate the throne, which, unlike what happened to his father 40 years earlier, allows Mary and William to take the throne peacefully and legally and try and sort of claim things in a more legal fashion, which essentially meant that parliamentarians had learnt their lesson of 40 years prior, and meant that it was a peaceful succession to the throne. And so you find then by the end of this period, which kind of takes us to the end of this sort of narrative, that by 1688 you have the second collapse of the Stuart monarchy, but in a rather different fashion. And that basically takes us through the entire narrative. So you have this period of essentially instability which runs throughout 1625 to 1688, and kind of punctuated by these two key turning points of a king being executed in 1625 and then a king being forced to abdicate in 1688 by a parliament who no longer wanted him in place. And those two events essentially sort of are what this entire course essentially revolves around, and is then a appropriate place to stop. And so I hope that basically makes the core narrative clear as a whole. As I say, I've not gone too much into the details of who exactly, or rather, I've not gone into too much detail about the actual specifics of what points you have to know for particular essays. But as I say, I feel it's just quite important to have a kind of core central understanding of, that main narrative which runs throughout this course. And so, if you have any questions about that narrative at all, if you can just leave any questions or comments in the section below, I'll be happy to respond to them. In particular, if there are kind of any points that I've glossed over quite quickly or not really explained in great detail, because as I say, I think this is a course that can be quite complicated. So thank you for listening.